This is a teacher training specific video. We are going to be talking about supporting ESL, multilingual, at-risk, developmental students, some version of those categories in a series. And so the first step is establishing a healthy classroom culture setting. There are some things that are that if we're looking at scholarship, whether it's been published by myself in a book chapter in translingual pedagogical perspectives or anywhere in the last 40 years, there are a variety of studies on language, identity, all kinds of fun stuff. We're just going to do the crash course version, assuming that this is not for people who are going to who want to have to worry about looking up all the scholarship. When we are developing a class, whether it's our WAC 101 course that is a support and builds into English 101, whether it is some institution has an English 081091, whether they're ESL courses. If we're building a class where there are multilingual students or students who are at risk, it does help to take a universal design approach to the classroom, where we design the class so that whatever level we get in the class, we meet students where they're at and then bring them to where we want them, where we're hoping they get to, or at least where they can make steady growth across the length of the course. And so part of classroom culture setting, there's a couple things that are generally recommended to avoid, especially when working with students who are struggling to develop another layer of proficiency, whether it's English or some other language. And so because a language identity, if we're going with Enzaldua, language identity is twin skin to cultural identity. And so if I cannot affirm, I'm spinning the language a little bit because I forgot a word. If I cannot value or affirm all of my language identities, it basically hurts how my cultural identity works too. I was doing so well, but that's a paraphrase. The short version is we want students to feel supported. We want them to be to know that they have the right to their own language, that the language resources they have matter, and that there is a difference between understanding grammar, which is knowledge of language, and grammar norms, which is the way we should enact language for a particular audience and particular context. One is very sociocultural expectation oriented, which tends to be what writing specialists emphasize if they're trying to teach standard written English or sedimented white English or academic English. And then we have grammar, which is, can we get students to look at how languages are built and find and discover patterns as language learners. That is something more meaningful than telling them you should do this, you shouldn't do this for a particular environment. Both are good, but getting students to be able to identify their own patterns, it gives them more agency. It makes it more about skill sets and less about identity. And so a lot of times, whether it's college writers, or not, but since most of my context is with college writers, a lot of times students come into the college course, especially multilingual students, with a sense that they are bad writers because their grammar is bad, because they're not adhering to some sort of norm. Go watch my linguistic aspect of writing videos to get a sense of how to address some of that, but or PTS for writing videos. But when we're setting culture in a classroom, it's really important that we're affirming what resources they have and display, and not letting, especially a developmental course, be a gatekeeping course, but rather a support, a confidence builder, and a skill builder, and an expertise builder. Sometimes people will, so before I get into that. So first, the classroom should be affirmational. You can teach people things that you don't take points off of an assignment for. So you can be walking students through sentence level clarity things, but that doesn't mean you have to take points off just because they miss a comma or misspell something or use a wrong word, especially if it's very early in the course and you're just trying to get them to practice getting words out. Now, why this matters is because if you focus on sentence level clarity early on in a course, you train a student to think more about is this sentence clear, and less about is this sentence meaningful. And so we want to, especially if we're teaching a course that's supposed to emphasize rhetoric or the writing process, we want students free writing, putting words onto paper, possibly even encoding in different languages or pictographically, like in visual systems, drawing things out to make the meaning valuable. So make something meaningful and purposeful without necessarily emphasizing early on in the semester or early on in a course a clarity of ideas. The expectation is that it starts messy and gets more refined. But if you start telling them early on or taking points off early on for small sentence level errors, you are culture setting a value that clear sentences are more important than meaningful sentences. And some students have had that so much without really being able to wrap their head around how the language works that it just feels like too much of the same, and you'll either lose them or you just won't enjoy the writing as much and they won't care about it as much. So let's flip this. If we're culture setting, think about the difference in belief for a student if their emphasis on meaning. How does that play out in practice? So students are thinking about who their audience is, rhetorical principle, whether you've got multilingual students or not. They're imagining an audience or multiple audiences. They're trying to craft a message that would be valuable for that audience. As they go and get engaged in finding a valuable thing to say and a meaningful thing to say, then they have a different intrinsic motivation to clean up sentences. But if you tell them to make sure there's clean sentences, the motivation to have something actually meaningful and not just clear goes away. So, culture setting practices, try to avoid punitive point loss as a result of sentence level traditional grammar errors according to academic English or SWE, at least early in a course. I usually recommend in the first 8 weeks of the course. There's so many course competencies you could choose from. You don't have to emphasize something, even if your course has that kind of competency. You don't have to emphasize it at the beginning. You can wait till the end of the course. Not a big deal. Competencies aren't for every part of the course. Competencies are across the whole of a course. So when we're culture setting, start with affirmation, producing words, producing meaningful words, and then making those things that are produced cleaner, more understandable, prettier. And then they have something, they care whether there's feedback, they care whether it's clear along the way. So I usually recommend, based on research and my own practice over the last 10 years, I recommend waiting till at least halfway through a course. Some people are only comfortable doing it for the first project. That's fine, but pay attention to how it changes the type of product you get. The other thing that sometimes is an acknowledgement of best practice, that writing is a process, but not necessarily doing something in the way we design the course so that we get the quality we want. So sometimes I will hear teachers get upset about the quality of their students' writing, and they will highlight that they asked students to submit 3 drafts along the way before the final, but nobody ever submitted those drafts, and so they couldn't get feedback, and so the final was basically a instant copy response done last minute. The students are tired, they turn in something they're not proud of, you give them a bunch of fix-it feedback, and then a cycle repeats and they do it again. So when you're asking students to submit process work, it's no good to do it for no points. Process work should have almost the same, in my practice, I find it's most effective if process work is almost adds up to almost the same level of points as the final product, because the final product will be better if they do those things, and you'll be happier about reading it if they actually submit those drafts along the way. So if you've got a final draft worth 100 points and you want them to submit 2 drafts leading up to it, those 2 drafts could each be worth 40 or 50 points per draft. And it's like, if the final product is 1,000 to 1,200 words, the first draft could be 300 to 400 words in 2 sources or whatever, and it could be just free writing, and the second draft could be 800 words, and the last draft is 1,000 to 1,200 and should be polished. So whatever those final expectations are, If you want your final draft to be higher quality and you want to make sure students have drafts the day of, make it worth points. Have them submit the drafts ahead of time, multiple days ahead of time if possible, before, so you have a chance to see who hasn't submitted it, check in with them, especially if you're going to do an in-class peer review or something like that. But these are things you have to think about before the class starts. Otherwise, you're in triage mode trying to figure out why students aren't submitting work and why you're upset that the quality or clarity or cleanness of the draft just isn't there. And you don't want to, it's not a good idea to spend all your time marking things that are just there as errors because they didn't take time. So we have a couple things when we're dealing with, it's not just a language thing sometimes. And if we have multilingual students, sometimes we'll default to that instead of seeing that there's a process that they've embodied or internalized that is giving you this product that you don't like. So, first step for culture setting, design the course in a way that gets you what you want. And one of the things that, and get students what they need. First, they need to know that writing and communication with another human is valuable, and that them producing it for someone should be more than just producing it for you. Give them a real audience and affirm the things that they have going for them. Affirm the language they do use or the practices they do well. And sometimes that's as simple as saying, good job using paragraphs, good jobs using transitional phrases, especially if it's a developmental group of students. But find things to affirm, and remember that feedback, it's good to have constructive feedback, but feedback doesn't have to just be corrective. Feedback can be praise, and 80% of feedback should be praise in substance and specific. This went really well. Peter Elbow talks about liking. It's like you can't give them constructive feedback if there's no proof that you actually like what you're reading. It just feels like hammering on them, beating them up with feedback, and it can lead students to feel hopeless, and we don't want that. So we want to know that we have to frame ourselves as someone who is affirmational, frame ourselves as someone who is encouraging and empathetic and is here to support their success. And we do that partially with our tone of voice and partially with the type of feedback we give. We can give praise for the first couple weeks of a course before giving any constructive or corrective feedback. There's nothing wrong with that. If they came into your class with things that were problematic, they're going to leave your class with things that are problematic, and it's not your job to fix all of that. And if fixing is the mindset you have, that's a problem too. Because they're going to feel you trying to fix them instead of you trying to support them. So those are the fast versions of culture setting that I will add to the series in more detail, but we need to be affirmational from the beginning. We need to be focused on giving students feedback that helps them see how good a writer they could be. We need to present writing in a way that it isn't just your grammar's bad, so you're a bad writer, right? And try and shift away from identity and get them into the toolboxes of writing and the skill sets of writing, and thinking of it as these are things that I can add to and that kind of stuff. So there are other videos that I'll be doing in this series. The first one is let's be affirmational, let's culture set. We don't have to take points off for corrective things. We want to make sure and highlight the values that matter most. And especially if we want a higher quality, we have to add points to drafts along the way. So with that, I'm going to leave that there and let you all have a wonderful day. If you have any questions about this and how I present it to students, you can go check out some of those other videos that